All right. I think we can get started. I think some folks are still coming in, but I want to give us plenty of time for discussion later. My name is Kristen Davis. I'm in Civil and Environmental Engineering here at UCI. And today I have the honor of welcoming Dr. Ermias Kebrab to UCI and the Solutions That Scale seminar series. Dr. Kebrab is the Associate Dean of Global Engagement and the Director of the World Food Center at UC Davis. He conducts research in animal nutrition, mathematical modeling of biological systems, and the impact of livestock on the environment. He holds the Cessnon Endowed Chair in Sustainable Agriculture, has contributed to the 2019 IPCC report, served and advised on committees for the Food and Agriculture Organization at the UN, National Academies of Sciences, and has given TED Talks. If you have questions during the course of the seminar, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll address those towards the end of the seminar. So thanks again for being here, Dr. Kebrab, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'll share my screen. Right. Okay, so hopefully, hopefully this is nice and clear.
We see the presenter view right now, so maybe switch.
Oh, okay. Usually, okay. Does that work or not yet?
No, maybe up at the top. Maybe up at the top, the display swap.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, thank you. All right, so it's my pleasure to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is livestock methane emissions, and trying to reduce this methane emissions and maybe help us in moving towards a climate neutral livestock production system. And so the environmental impact of livestock production in general, as you can see from this pie chart, is about 5.8% globally. And quite a bit of that comes from methane as well. So agriculture in general, in total, just if you look at the whole sort of world, from agriculture, forestry, and land use, about almost 20%. And then about 6% of that is livestock and manure, and quite a bit of that is methane. So if you look at where methane comes from, the largest source of methane is from agriculture and waste, and particularly ruminants such as cattle. And globally, livestock are responsible for about 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions, but it is quite variable depending where you are. In the US, for example, it's about 4% of direct emissions, while in New Zealand, it's about 43% of the emissions. And according to FAO, the demand for animal products is increasing, particularly in low and middle-income countries, which means that those emissions will go up as well as we increase the demand. Normally, there's an increase in animal numbers as well, and that will have an effect on the amount of methane that's being released into the atmosphere. So here, for the US situation, about 10% of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the United States is from agriculture. So in this case, it's shown as a cow, but actually it's all of agriculture. So plant agriculture and animal agriculture, all of that is 10%. And the livestock part is about 4%. And if we dig a little bit deeper and see where those greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, this shows that the vast majority, about 70% of the emissions is actually from enteric methane emissions. So that's from the cow itself. The belching of the cow is about 70%. You have a little bit from manure management and also nitrous oxide from manure management as well. The contribution from manure management in California is probably a little bit higher than the nation average because for two factors. One is that we are the biggest dairy state in the country, and also we use lagoons to hold the manure, which means that there's a nice environment for the methanogens to convert organic matter into methane. So the contribution is a little bit higher, and it's warmer as well. And so in other parts of the country, it's frozen a few months of the year, and that would prevent from methane from being released from the lagoons. So there has been a lot of interest in trying to reduce methane emissions in general, because livestock and agriculture in general is the #1 source of anthropogenic methane. There's a lot of interest in trying to reduce that. There has been a lot of different type of things that's been tried on, and those range from just looking at the directly affecting the adult animal through inhibitors or even vaccines, going through indirectly by changing their diets and changing what is in the diet and adding some things into the diet as well, and trying to look into antimicrobials as well. More recently, there's been an effort to look at sort of the young animals, try to affect it right from when they are young by defaunation, sort of changing the microbial flora in the gut of the animals, and also through even before birth, through breeding and selecting animals that have naturally low methane emitting animals. So I'm just going to go through some of those and give you examples of what has been happening and what the potential of this is going to be in the future as well. For the last few decades, we have seen an improvement in genetics and nutrition that resulted in substantial reduction of greenhouse gas intensity. So when I'm talking about intensity, I'm talking about the amount of emissions per unit of product. So in this case, it's milk production. This work was done in California, and what we're trying to do here is what happened to the emissions in 1950 or 1960s compared to 2014 for producing 1 kilogram of energy corrected milk. So we need to do the correction for milk, because all milk are not created equal. Some milk will have more protein, some have more fat. So we need to standardize that. So when you look at the standardized milk, how much emissions has changed over the last 50 years. And as you can see here, there's quite a big drop in feed production related kind of emissions, and that is because of better yield of the crops and better crop management, and all that has resulted in a quite significant reduction in emissions. Farm management, this is sort of the energy that we use in the farm system. Enteric methane, this is the subject that I'm talking about today. And then manure management hasn't changed much. This is because we are using the lagoons, as I said earlier. But overall, if you look at the whole life cycle of producing a kilogram of milk in California, now is much less than used to be about 50 years ago. So we've seen 45% reduction. And this is actually a very conservative estimate, because there has been a lot of other things that's been happening. And we calculated this for 2014. If we probably need to update this, and if you did it now for 2022, we will see even further reductions, because there's been a building of anaerobic digesters that really help in reducing emissions from manure. There's been sort of using more efficient energy as well. And so all of that combined will have an impact in reducing the amount of emissions associated with producing 1 kilogram of milk production in the state. So that's one way that's been happening, and it will continue to happen as well. And the other way that could happen or could make a difference is by adding lipids and plant extracts into the system. And this way, we've done some sort of analysis just to look at if we were to add lipids or amend diets by adding lipids into diets around the world, what kind of reduction you would expect. So the top panel is for 2012, and the lower panel is for 2050. And as you can see, there is quite huge potential in areas like India and China and South America and Brazil, by changing the diet, by adapting the diet or amending the diet with more lipids. You can see quite a big reduction there as well. And if we look at 2050, it's even more importance, particularly in China and India, where there are a lot of cattle. India has about 330 million, but a third of all cattle in the world are in India, and they're not high producing animals as well. So the combination of the amount and the low productivity, the contribution from that sector alone is quite high. But by changing the diet, at least there is some there's potential to reduce those emissions. The other thing that we've been working, and really the focus of this talk, is looking at some feed additives that directly inhibit methanogenesis. And this is a summary of what has been done in terms of different type of feed additives that have been tried over the last few years in particular, and trying to rank them in terms of their effectiveness to reduce methane emissions. You see the top one here is seaweed. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about seaweed and why it has the potential to reduce these emissions quite substantially. Fatty acids, as I mentioned earlier, lipids have a potential to reduce emissions quite substantially as well. But the issue with the lipids is that the range is quite narrow, because ruminant diets normally contain about 3% fats in the diet. You can increase it up to 6 to 7%. Over 6 to 7%, then it affects the digestion of fiber in particular. And so there's low productivity if you increase it too much, and the animals don't like it, they don't eat it as well. So their intake drops and their productivity drops. So we have that small window between 3 to 6% where we can increase a little bit of that. And sometimes the fat sources might be expensive as well. So it might add to the cost of the diet. So it may not be as feasible as you would like it to be. So the other feed additive that has been shown to work really, really well is this 3-NOP, and I'll be talking about it in a little bit as well. And others that have shown promise, but is quite variable, are what are called this plant secondary compounds. These are compounds that plants, particularly in tropical countries, secrete in their cells, mostly for defense mechanism. So plants like oregano and plants containing tannins and saponins, they have been shown to reduce emissions. Nitrates is also reduce emissions. The issue with nitrate is that if it is given in high quantities, nitrate can be converted into nitrite by the animals, and nitrite can be absorbed in blood and cause toxicity. So it can be toxic to the animals in high doses. So you need to be in much lower doses. Agaline is a secondary, it's a mixture of secondary compounds, particularly essential oils. Monensin, it's antibacterial. Biochar is basically carbon, from, it can be from different type of plant material. And then there are garlic and saponins have been shown to reduce emissions as well. As I said, this secondary plant compounds, it's still under study. It's not really, there's no consistent reduction that we see. So the first one that I want to talk about is microalgae or seaweed. And the way that this whole thing started was a few years ago. A group of scientists in Australia looked at different seaweed for their effectiveness to reduce methane emissions. And what they've seen is that one particular species, Aspragopsis taxiformis, reduced emission almost completely at the level of 2%. And so that's kind of resulted in really interest in trying to figure out why this is doing it and how it's working, and is this repeatable? And so we got in touch with the Australian team, and we got some samples from them. And when we tried it here in Davis, we saw similar results as well. So we were really interested in going ahead and really to try it in live animals as well. And so we tried this first of all in dairy cattle and then in beef cattle. So I just want to show you a quick video. This was actually broadcasted on Sunday of what looks like when we are doing this in real animals. So let's do this now. So.
On American Experience, the story of 3 Black diplomats.
The State Department had the well-deserved reputation of being extremely elitist.
Pale, male, and Yale.
Who broke racial barriers.
Fact of the matter was, they could never conceive that a black man could ever be an ambassador.
It is hard to do the work of America when you have been Jim Crowed by your own government.
The American Diplomat on American Experience.
Advertisement for BBS. This is not part of
livestock production is responsible for about 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The majority of that is in the form of methane, which is more than 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. Most of that methane is a natural byproduct of how livestock, particularly cows, process food. But as NewsHour Weekend's Christopher Booker reports, scientists are hoping that small tweaks in what cows eat can dramatically reduce a major source of these climate change-causing emissions. This segment is part of our ongoing series, Peril and Promise, the challenge of climate change.
At the University of California at Davis, 18 cows are cordoned off from others on the campus's dairy facility. They're part of an ongoing series of studies to dramatically reduce the climate impact of dairy and beef production. Globally, cows and other livestock are responsible for about 40% of methane emissions, a potent greenhouse gas. In digesting their high-fiber diet, cows emit methane as a byproduct, making them one of the least climate-friendly sources of food on the planet.
The idea was to try to see if we can do something about the way in which the methane is being formed by giving them some additives.
Ermias Kabrab is a professor at UC Davis, and he's been studying how dietary supplements affect the amount of methane a cow emits, almost all of which comes out of its front end.
About 89% of the methane is actually been formed in the gut of the animal. And almost all of that is then eructated out or belched out from the animal, so the nostrils and the mouth. We don't care about the back end.
Kabrab's research has shown that it doesn't take a lot to dramatically alter the amount of methane burped out. In a study that was published last year, his lab found that adding just 3 ounces of seaweed each day reduced methane emissions by 82%.
I've been in this business for about 20 years or so, having this amount of impact, it was it completely blew my mind. You know, I didn't even believe when I saw the results first. You know, I did not expect it at all.
Those results have since been replicated, and Kabrab's lab is now testing other kinds of methane-reducing additives that have shown promise in lab tests.
Cows are creatures of habit, so they don't like when you change things on them.
Mallory Honan is a doctoral student at UC Davis and running this 12-week experiment testing a new microbial probiotic additive called Amplio.
I will sample their milk as well as their blood. I weigh them weekly just to make sure that we're not compromising any of their important production parameters. Because if we feed an additive that reduces methane, but then it compromises all these components that the farmers are paid for, then it's not really actually helping.
Measuring the methane requires a special stall called a green feed machine that delivers little treats called cow cookies. While the cow is inside this stall eating, data on methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen are collected.
They have access to the green feed all the time because methane isn't emitted at a constant rate. So if you measured methane from a cow right at this moment, that's not necessarily what she's emitting all day because it's very much linked to their feed intake. So we want to be measuring methane over a 24-hour scale and getting as many data points as possible.
Testing the impact of these additives requires meticulous control of the cow's diet. Each animal's total feed is carefully measured, and electronic collars ensure that each goes only to its own stall. The additive being studied and a control placebo are also carefully measured.
These trials are really proof of concept to make sure that they're eating the full dose and that we're seeing the effects from that full dose. Because when you scale this up and go to a bigger commercial farm, they're not going to be able to measure everything so individually. We're going to be seeing everything at a herd level. So this is our opportunity to see the effect that it has on an individual cow.
While many of these additives are not commercially available yet, Kabrab hopes that costs will be minimal and might even be offset by farmers selling carbon credits for the amount of greenhouse gas emissions reduced by the supplements.
In California, we are even especially incentivized because we have on the books on legislation to reduce methane emissions by 40% by 2030.
Kabrab says interventions like the one he is studying are key to feeding the world without worsening climate change.
There's always going to be more demand. I mean, particularly in low-income countries, the demand is growing. So we're trying to come up with solutions that is applicable around the world and try to sustainably produce animal source food. So solving this or reducing it significantly, by additives, by different methods, that would really help us into going into a carbon neutral livestock production system.
Okay. All right. Okay, so are we back on where we were?
We are seeing the presentation view again.
I have to do that again.
Here we go.
Okay,
Perfect.
there you go. All right, thank you. Right, so after this, so now you've seen how we actually measure the whole emissions, and so we did a work with the seaweed, and what we've seen was there was a dramatic reduction in emissions. This was the first study that was done in dairy cattle, and we didn't really know how much to give them to begin with. So we started with a very little amount, and then we going up to 1%, and we saw that above 1%, the animals were not eating as much feed because the seaweed is a bit salty, and it's a new kind of feed, so they don't really like when there's something new. They might get used to it later on, but this study was, they were given only for about 2 weeks at a time. And so there was a short-term experiment just to see if this stuff actually works or not. And so really interesting aspect is that when we looked at it in vitro in the lab, we needed to go to 2% of diameter to have this effect. But in vivo, it's actually up to 1%. We were seeing it quite an impressive reduction as well. So that was another surprise that we saw that we haven't seen in other feed additives before. And so we had a number of questions after that initial work. So that we wanted to answer the question, would the microbes be able to get used to it? Because we've seen other feed additives in which the microbes kind of get adjusted to it, and other microbes are promoted, some are not promoted, and that way they kind of adjust, and the methane levels come back up to again. We also wanted to know if the seaweed would be stable over a long period of time. And we also wanted to see if it has an effect on the taste of the product as well, both milk and meat. And we wanted to see if there is an effect on productivity, because if it reduces productivity, it's not going to be taken over. So we wanted to address all these questions. And so we devised another experiment. We wanted to go a longer period of experiment because we wanted to see if there is any kind of adaptation. And we used seaweed that was harvested 3 years prior in Australia, and it was sent to us and shipped to us. And then we, at the end of the experiments, we looked at the quality of the meat and the taste of the meat as well. So we had this experiment run for 21 weeks. And we have 3 treatments. The first one is the control, so no additive. And with no additive, you can see that there was a dip in methane emissions after 12 weeks. And that happened because we changed the diet after 12 weeks. This is a normal thing that happens in a beef industry, is that at the beginning, when they're younger, you feed more forage to the cows. And then towards the end, particularly the last 3 months, they're going to be on high grain diet. And methane is really affected by the amount of fiber in the diet. And so at the beginning, there's going to be higher fiber and then higher methane. And then towards the end, it was going to be lower fiber and lower methane. So this is exactly what we would have expected it, and it shows that there was a reduction later on because of the diet. And then when we added at 0.25% the seaweed, you can see that there was quite a big drop in emissions throughout the entire experimental period. And when we did it with increase it to 0.5, the same thing happened, further increases, and also there is quite a bit of reduction all the way up to the 21 weeks. So there was no adaptation by the microbes, which is really good to see. There was an effect of diet. So the higher the fiber, the less effective it is, but the effectiveness basically was between 60% to 82%. In Australia, they actually have seen up to 98% because they were using fresh seaweed. So this is after 3 years, still was potent enough to reduce emissions by just over 80%. And so how is it working? Well, basically the seaweed actually has halogenated compounds such as bromoform that are accumulated in specialized glands in a seaweed for defense mechanism. And we've known for a long time that halogenated compounds reduce methane emissions. And in this study, what we did was we performed a comparative omics analysis to determine if the reduction of gut methane was caused primarily by the reduction in the abundance of the methanogens, or is it by downregulation of methanogenic genes and pathways? And the results here suggest that the abundance of methanogenic population remains stable, and the reduction of methanogenesis in the presence of Aspragopsis was triggered by downregulation of several genes in the methanogenesis pathway. So in this volcano plot of differential gene expression, you can see that the red dots represent the downregulated of genes in treatment group compared to control, and the blue dots represent the upregulation of genes compared to the control. So you see quite a number of genes have been downregulated, and that's why we see lower amount of methane in the presence of Aspragopsis. And the other question was, how about productivity? This is really, really important in livestock production system because the margins are already small enough. You can't really add more to that. So this graph shows changes induced over 90 days treatment period in average daily weight gain and feed conversion ratio. So the lines are the feed conversion ratio in steers. They were consuming total mixed ration, and they have different inclusion levels of Aspragopsis. 0 is the control, and then 0.05% is quite low seaweed, and then 0.1%, and then 0.2% of their organic matter intake. And so you can see that there's quite a big increase in average daily gain, and then an improvement in feed conversion ratio, which means that it will save money to the farmers, and that money can potentially be used to purchase seaweed for reduction of methane and improvement of body weight gain. The downside of bromoform is that it depletes the ozone layer. So any production of seaweed needs to make sure that it doesn't add to the amount of bromoform released naturally. Some wild collected Aspragopsis also have greater amount of iodine and bromine that may end up in milk. So it needs either to be processed if it was wild collected, or these days it's actually being grown in aquaculture setting. So we can manipulate the amount of inorganic minerals that are around when you grow it. So if you can control the inorganic compounds in the seaweed and then increase the amount of bromoform, then this would be a very viable solution. So what's happening now? Well, we know that seaweed can work well, but the cultivation of seaweed has been quite challenging. But there are a number of efforts that are going on at the moment. Blue Ocean Barns is a company based in Hawaii. It's now doing this in a lab and actually growing a substantial amount of seaweed. They actually grow enough seaweed to do a trial in Northern California on a real farm. And they've seen a reduction of about 52%, and they believe that they have a better seaweed now, and they can push that up to 60-70% as well. So we'll see, and they say that they will be able to produce enough to feed all cattle in the U.S. by 2030. There are also other companies in the US, like Symprosia, and then there's another company in Sweden that are doing this and growing and that are trying to come up with solutions to sustainably grow seaweed. Now, moving on to a different feed additive, this feed additive called 3-NOP or 3-nitroxypropanol, that it cuts emissions by about 40% in dairy cattle, between 30 to 40% in dairy cattle. This is probably one of the most extensively studied feed additive out there. There's been about 40 studies conducted all over the world, a few of them in the US, some in Canada and Australia, in Europe. And when we did a meta-analysis of all these studies that have been conducted, we've seen about 32, excuse me, between 32 to 39% reduction in emissions. And this is a very consistent kind of thing. You can look at the dose and the type of animal and the type of diet, then you can easily predict how much reduction you can get by using this feed additive, 3-NOP or bovine as it's called in Europe these days. And one interesting aspect of this is that there's a study where they fed this 3-NOP early in life. So when they are calves, in the first 3 weeks of their life, they were given 3-NOP, and then they stopped giving 3-NOP and they just kept measuring their methane emissions. And what they have seen so far over a year is that they are producing less methane than the control animals. So just giving them for the first 3 weeks, it seems to kind of reprogram the gut microbes so that those that produce methane are not promoted, so that other bacteria are taken over or other microbes are taken over. So you can see that over the year, they are still producing less methane. This project is still continuing, so we'll see when they go into lactation phase, if this continues during lactation as well, because during lactation is when most of the methane emissions is coming out, because they'll be consuming about 25-30 kilograms a day, and then they'll be producing 400 to 500 grams of methane per day as well. So the mode of action, 3-NOP is actually a very simple compound. It consists of a molecule of propylene glycol and nitrate, and binding it together gives you 3-NOP. The interesting fact is that 3-NOP resembles a key molecule in methane formation, which is the methyl coenzyme M reductase, or MCR for short. And 3-NOP specifically targets this MCR, which is it's an enzyme that contains nickel ion, and it needs to be on the oxidation state in order for the reaction to move ahead. And MCR catalyzes this methane forming step in the rumen fermentation. So what 3-NOP does is it preferably binds into the active side of this MCR and effectively inactivates it. So 3-NOP is demonstrated to inhibit growth of methanogenic archaea at concentrations that do not affect other non-methanogenic bacteria in the rumen. So it's very, very specific to methanogens, which is really good because you don't want to have any other impact on the animal and change the products and the efficiency that's required as well. In dairy cattle, so far, they have not seen any improvements in feed intake or in milk production. But in beef, there may be some improvement, like we saw in seaweed with 3-NOP. There might be some improvement as well. So there's some big scale trials are happening at the moment, and hopefully that will show a reduction in emissions. So this actually has been approved in Brazil and Chile, and about 2-3 weeks ago, it was approved in the European Union. So we expect to see this on the market in the European Union and in South America very soon. They already set up a production facility in Scotland, but in the US, we won't see it for some time because it needs to be approved by FDA, and FDA considers changing methane as a veterinary drug. So there's a lot more hoops to go through in the US before we can see it and we can use it here with our cows. We did some kind of modeling to try to understand what's happening. And this is basically looking at the 3 doses. The black line is 0 dose, and then the purple or the pink line is at 0.5%, and then the green line is at the 1%. And we looked at the total amount of volatile fatty acids. This is basically the energy that the animal is getting, and we didn't see any change in the total amount of volatile fatty acid, which is good. We looked at the hydrogen pressure. This is very as expected. As you increase the reduction potential, the amount of hydrogen in the rumen increases as well. The methane emissions, as expected, will be reduced by as you increase the dose. And the last 3 boxes show different proportions of volatile fatty acids. This is how the animal gets energy when fiber is degraded. And it shows that the acetate proportion is reduced and the propionate production is increased when you reduce methane emissions. This is great because propionate and butyrate production are the glucogenic type of volatile fatty acids. They contain more energy, and they utilize hydrogen, while acetate, it produces hydrogen, so it adds more to hydrogen where it's already elevated. So that's why acetate is being downregulated, while propionate and butyrate is being upregulated for the use of the animals. So briefly touching into the plant bioactive compounds, essential oils have been shown to reduce emissions. One in particular called Mutrol. It is a combination of garlic and citrus extract. It was added about 15 grams per day. And we've seen a reduction, but the most effective reduction we've seen was after 12 weeks. It was about 23% reduction after 12 weeks. And we are going to be doing a much bigger experiment soon. And then we will extend it to 18 weeks to see if that effect keeps growing, or there is a moment where that reduction potential levels off. The other thing that we've tried is lemongrass. Lemongrass at 2% dry matter intake reduced emissions by 33% in Mexico. So that was really great results. So we thought we would do the same thing here in California as well. Unfortunately, the California grown lemongrass did not reduce methane emissions. You might have seen this promoted by Burger King. It was supported by Burger King, and they went out and basically told farmers to start using lemongrass. But unfortunately, all lemongrass does not work equally well. It needs to have a certain amount of tannins and essential oils or phenolic compounds in it to be able to reduce methane emissions. So before using lemongrass, I think you can just go into a lab and look at the amount of tannins and phenolic compounds in it, and then you can change it that way. The others that is really important for California is using grape pomace, what's left over after you squeezed out the juices for winemaking as well as for oil. And we're going to be doing some work here in Davis in the next year or so to try to figure out what type of variety of grapes would give us the biggest reduction in methane emissions. There have been a lot of other solutions that came about, but we don't have time to discuss them. But there are about 30 or so different types of things that can be done. Some of them can be done easily, some not so much, and it also is quite region specific as well. It depends which region you are in. The genomic selection also has the potential to reduce emissions. This is basically by improving feed efficiency, you can reduce the methane intensity. This is because the animals will be eating less but producing the same amount, which means that there will be less emissions associated with the crop production, and then less emissions associated with the animal itself, because if you keep them for less amount of time and they are gaining just as much weight, then you're reducing the amount of methane emissions for the total life cycle of that animal as well. So there's more work that's been done here. It's a little bit of a longer term, but we hope that about 15% reduction can come from genomic selection as well. But I think the important thing is that we need to look at it in a holistic way, so that we don't have emission trade-offs. For example, in this case, when you are using things like 3-NOP, 3-NOP production also produces some greenhouse gas emissions, particularly carbon dioxide. So that needs to be included as well. So you need to look at what's the impact on crop production. In this case, it doesn't change the feed intake, so there is no impact on crop production. But if you're using things like nitrate, this will change because you're substituting one thing to another. So you have to look at the crop production effect as well. In this case, farm management does not change. What it changed quite a bit is the enteric methane emissions. So as we saw, about 30 to 40% reduction is happening. It doesn't affect the manure storage. So then when you look at sort of the total life cycle reduction for production of 1 kilogram of milk, there's about 12% reduction happening there. One quick point I wanted to make is that methane has a different way of impacting the environment compared to carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide keeps on going on in the atmosphere, while methane actually is destroyed after about a decade or so. So if we actually stop producing methane now in about 10, 20 years, we can see a huge impact on the climate. And by some estimates, if we actually reduce methane by 0.3% per year, and in the next 10 to 20 years, we can actually stop any warming from methane. And so that's why it's really important to act on methane right now, because we will have a short-term benefit very quickly by doing so. And the other thing that what we're trying to do is improving productivity in low-income countries. This is in Burkina Faso back in November, where we are providing some training to use a software that would help farmers give the animals exactly what they need. And that way they improve their productivity, and the reduction in emissions per unit of product will be reduced as well. You may have seen it that there is now what's called the Global Methane Pledge. About 111 countries have signed up to this. And basically, the idea is to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And without reducing livestock emissions, we can't get there. And so it's really, really important for us to be able to do that and work on reducing methane emissions, as methane from livestock is about a third of all methane that's been emitted, all anthropogenic source of methane. So that's why we are really focused to trying to reduce this methane. And if you can get the seaweed to work the way that we want it to work, then we can see quite a substantial reduction in emissions. So in conclusion, several solutions to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions have been developed. Then there are some really exciting practical solutions that are on the way. Here I say that they are not still on the market, but it's very, very close. I'm hoping that the 3-NOP will be on the market in the next few months. And there has been a development of a protocol so that we can actually use this protocol to account for the reduction, and we can use it to claim carbon credits. Right now, the price of carbon is too low. It's about $10 per ton of carbon on the open market or the voluntary market. But in California, you can get up to 15, 20 on the offset system. But with incentives, California can get up to 100, even 200 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of carbon. And that would make it, that would completely change the game. So I'm hoping that in the next 5 years, we will see about 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions coming from the livestock industry. And just a lot of this work is done by my students and postdocs, and so they do all the hard work and going out to the dairy on a daily basis, and including lights. So just want to acknowledge all that work that's been happening in the lab. And if you have a bit of time, it's about a 10-minute video on this on TED. So you can look at TED.com, and you can just search seaweed or methane, and it should come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kibrab. That was excellent. I encourage everyone to submit questions in the Q&A. We have one from Dele. He says, thanks for your excellent presentation. During these experiments, are the animals fed with feeds supplemented with antibiotics? And could this affect the gut microbiome, but also a potential problem for the emergence of antibiotic-resistant pathogens?
Right, that's a good question. So we don't supplement antibiotics to the animals. In fact, California has banned the use of antibiotics for non-therapeutic purposes. Only use it when animal is sick. So yeah, no antibiotics are used. So sometimes people use monensin. It's ionophore. It's also an antibacterial. When we do this kind of experiments, we remove that. We don't want to have any kind of interference from any other additives. We try to make it as sort of, the effect needs to be as much as possible due to those feed additives. So we don't add any antibiotics or anything like that.
Thanks. I have a question about, you mentioned the use of genetic tools for optimizing feed efficiency for the cows, but there are also efforts underway to kind of think about genetic optimization of seaweed, content for different end uses, and I could imagine that would be true if your end use was for, a feed and for, really containing the compounds that are important to achieve this methane reduction. Do you know if that's going on? And what does that look like? Or is it more just exploring different natural, like existing seaweeds right now that are being cultivated?
My belief is that it's going in that direction. Right now, it's more to try to understand how this is working, how to grow it and all that. But yeah, there is a plan to do a genetic selection or genomic type of work with the seaweed as well. I know Blue Ocean Barns works with UC San Diego on that aspect, and to trying to look at how do we enrich the bromoform contents in the seaweed, because that's really what we need. We don't really need any of the other compounds within the seaweed. There are other halogenetic compounds, but the main one is bromoform. And we've looked at in vitro, and as you increase that level of bromoform, you don't need to include as much of the seaweed into the diet. So it basically means that the animals won't even know that there is something else in there, because one of the challenges we had at the beginning was when we're giving them up to 1% of diet, like in dairy cows, that means about 250 grams or so, and they can taste it. Yeah. Even if we were mixing it with molasses, to give it a bit more sweeter kind of flavor, and also helps us stick with the feed. It was still, they can still notice that, and we saw that there was a little bit drop in their feed intake. Yeah. But if you're giving them very, very small amounts with highly enriched bromoform content, then it will be quite easy to do that. And
recognize the problem from trying to feed my children vegetables. Okay. When it's in there.
yeah, exactly. So trying to concentrate that and so that they won't notice it.
In fact, I tried to feed them seaweed too, because I've studied seaweed, so it goes down about the same way. More than 1% doesn't work. Okay. So these Blue Ocean Barns that you're working with, you said they're growing on land currently, but they're hoping to move out to grow offshore. Is that true?
Yeah, so they have their stock sort of kind of by the ocean. They are based in Hawaii. So Hawaii is one of the places where it naturally grows well. So they kind of have their stock from there, and then they put it into the lab, and then they try to grow it in an aquaculture system. So they're trying to basically develop a method of increasing the productivity in the aquaculture system, so they have more control. Because the issue is that you don't want to have too much, or you want to have a consistent product. So if you do it in an open kind of ocean, you're not going to get a consistent product. But if you do it in a more aquaculture, then you will get, you will know the amount of bromoform, you know the amount of bromine, iodine, and all other inorganic compounds that may have an impact and on the amounts of that kind of compound in the milk. So the way it happens is that if there is higher concentration of inorganic compounds in the feed that the animal is consuming, a lot of it, if they are dairy cattle, it comes out in milk.
Yeah.
A lot of it is secreted in milk. So that's why you see a concentration of iodine and bromine in milk when you have higher concentrations in the feed. While for meat, it doesn't matter as much, because if beef cattle are consuming this, a lot of the inorganic compound in excess of their requirement is excreted in urine or feces, so it's fine. But in dairy cattle, because of the they're producing 40 kilograms of milk a day, so a lot of that will contain those inorganic compounds.
Okay, interesting. We have a couple of other questions in the chat, so I'll read one from Candelaria Bergero. Thank you for your presentation. Could there be detrimental long-term effects associated with supplementing cows' diet with something that they were not eating before, both for the cows themselves and in terms of emissions? And how long have these studies lasted?
Yeah, so the longest study that has been done is the one that we've done for 5 months. But seaweed actually is not alien to animals. I was actually in Scotland in October, where I visited sheep that basically forage on seaweed. I mean, they eat seaweed. I mean, the taste of meat is slightly different, but apart from that, they've been doing that for generations. Also, in a lot of places in Europe and North America, cows that live close by the ocean, they forage on seaweed. They've been doing that for a long time, and they're not foraging on Aspragopsis, unfortunately, but they have been consuming seaweed when they are sort of subjected to it. They're okay. So I don't think that there's going to be a long-term effect. But in terms of emissions, what it does to the rumen, to the gut, that needs to be studied. It needs to be studied for at least 1 or 2 lactations, for 2 years or so. So we're trying to work with the Global Methane Hub to help us do that, because it's quite an expensive experiment to do when you're keeping animals for 2 years and feeding them seaweed and all that. So, so for all feed additives, that needs to be done. And so we're trying to work with those, with the Global Methane Hub to do that for all feed additives, to make sure that there's no unintended long-term impact on those as well.
Great. We have a question from Dean James Bullock. Do you have dialogue with farmers in California and elsewhere? And what will be required to make it more likely for them to adopt some of these strategies?
Yeah, so we always have dialogue with farmers. In fact, one of the first supporters of the seaweed work was a farmer in Northern California, and he actually did another work at his facility, and we're doing some work now in Modesto, a farm trial as well. So yeah, we work all the time with farmers, with farmer organizations in particular. We communicate our findings at the California Sustainability Summit, which is going to happen in April again. So yeah, we are in constant talk with them, and one of the things that would really sort of move the needle is if there are some incentives for this. So we work with the state of California to do that, and one of the things that we've done is we developed a protocol so that the state can look at this protocol and give credit to farmers reducing carbon. I mean, right now there is the LCFS program, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard program, where it gives farmers, I think it's like $200 per ton of carbon reduced when they are when doing that through manure management, particularly through anaerobic digesters. If that can happen for enteric methane emissions, that's a game changer. Then farmers would be more than happy to use those feed additives, particularly 3-NOP and seaweed, where the reductions are substantial. And if you have large farms, then you will be able to make enough to justify using those for the farmers.
Great. So you mentioned Aspragopsis, and then you mentioned that there are some other seaweed types being tried. What are some of the most promising other species? Are they also tropical reds, or are there any other?
Well, right now, Aspragopsis is completely in a different category, but there are some tropical seaweeds. I can't remember the name exactly, but some work based in India have shown that there's a reduction, maybe 20 to 30% by using those seaweeds as well. A lot of the seaweeds contain a little bit of bromoform. So those that contain some of the bromoform have that ability. So it's not as much, particularly when you've seen 80, 90%, right. Then the 20, 30% seems almost insignificant. So, but I mean, if they are easy to produce, and if there's not as much issue in terms of the concentration of bromoform and all that, then that might be a way to go as well. But I think right now a lot of the focus has been on Aspragopsis and other seaweeds for as a supplement. So basically replacing ingredients. So for their protein and fat and other things, not for methane reduction.
Great. Well, I want to thank you again, Dr. Mayas. That was Dr. Kebrab. That was a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it and hope that we can talk seaweed and cows again soon. I don't see any other questions. And so I think that we'll call it there.
Thank you very much. That's great. All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.